Good evening. Thank you, David, for leading that song. I think that's very appropriate given what is going on in our church right now, by meaning that we have so many sick individuals, so many that are about to go on to their reward. And while we want what's best for them, it's also difficult to see them and their family endure what they're going through. And just this weekend, we've had two wonderful families dealing with heartache, with the Nicholsons, with the Ellises, and then, of course, Nelda continuing to struggle with her health and battling cancer. And just so many right now that are dealing with difficult things. To sing it as well with my soul means something every time we sing it, but certainly right now. And within the midst of all of this, we had a baptism at 4 o'clock this afternoon. A gentleman that has been visiting with us, Mike Glackmeyer, was baptized. He is about to be deployed for 6 months, but this is something he has been pondering, thinking about for quite some time, and so he did that today, and so we're excited about that too. That is definitely a bright spot with all of the sickness that we have been dealing with in the congregation. And I want you to think about him and his wife Catherine and his 2 kids as he is about to leave and embark on a deployment, but also think about these families that we have been mentioning. It's a difficult time right now. We'll get through it, but this is a cycle that's not all that enjoyable. And so let's pray for these families. And we're continuing our series on better Bible study. And specifically, we're looking at different versions or translations of the Bible. Often I get the question, is my Bible a good one? And often I'll hear somebody ask, what do you think about this version? What do you think about that version? Sometimes I can't give them an answer. I'm like you. I get tunnel vision. I get focused in on the version that I use, or maybe the couple versions that I use. I don't really research the other ones. As you know, there's other versions coming out all the time. And so I can't always give you a good or definite answer, but we're looking at some of the strengths and weaknesses of the more popular versions. And if you'll remember, we talked about last week just some guiding principles, some things that we need to know and to get straight before we go any further looking at and dissecting the strengths and the weaknesses of different Bible versions. The first thing we said is that we don't have the original manuscripts, okay? Now, we are relying on the Word being faithfully preserved through copies, but we don't have the original manuscripts. And so we are taking these mountains of manuscripts. I mean, there's thousands of manuscripts, and we are reading those, and that's what we are looking at today. But we can believe that they were faithfully preserved. I believe that they were, and I think that we can put full faith and confidence in the fact that they were. But the more manuscripts we discover, the better our translations are going to be. We talked about this last week. Sometimes people hold the King James Version of the Bible in highest esteem. It was the version that Paul used, and so therefore it's the only version that we should use. But folks, it's not superior, simply because we have more manuscripts today than in 1611 when it was published. We know more about Semitics. We know more about the original language. We have more archaeological discoveries that have been unearthed. So it pales in comparison to those facts that we just have more evidence, right? And the more manuscripts that are discovered, the better our translations will be. But I hear people sometimes say, well, I don't put any stock into those modern versions. Those modern versions aren't worth the paper they're printed on. That's not true. Some of them may not be, but many of them are better. They're far superior because they consider more evidence, right? It's not the fault of the King James necessarily or the American Standard. It's just we have more evidence. And so therefore our translations are going to be better, hopefully. Secondly, translators have certain biases or prejudices. They just do. That's unfortunate. And as we talked about last week, there are different philosophies that are used by different translators. For instance, there is a word-for-word translation or philosophy, and that is taking the original and bringing it over to the English, comparatively speaking. And then you have the thought-for-thought idea or philosophy. And thought-for-thought is concerned less about a word-for-word and more about just expressing the main thought. Now, by and large, I would suggest that you always use a thought-for-thought translation. However, word for word translation. However, thought for thought can be useful at times, and thought for thought has to be used at times because, like we talked about last week, there are some things that just don't translate. For instance, we could say it's raining cats and dogs. That doesn't translate into the Greek. Nor would a similar phrase that might be understood in the Greek translate over into English. So sometimes you have to go to a thought-for-thought philosophy. But your Bible should have a page in the front somewhere that tells you what the philosophy was of the scholars, what they were intending to get at, or what they were aiming for when they created this version or when they came up with this version, okay? English words are always changing, something else that we need to know. We talked about that last week. The King James has a lot of outdated words. Words are always changing. And so therefore we have to keep up with our translations. They have to match the changing of these words. And if the Lord doesn't come back in the next 100 to 200 years, there will have to be more modern translations or versions that catch up because words are always changing. And we need to account for that. And then also I would say use multiple translations. Don't be afraid to use multiple translations. I think you're doing yourself a disservice by only using one translation in your Bible study. Even if you use a thought for thought or dynamic equivalency that maybe is not word for word, you can still use it. You may use it more like a commentary rather than a true Bible translation, but even that can be helpful at times. I just want to say a lot of the versions that we think are devilish may not be as bad as we think that they are. Because like we talked about last week, there is no perfect version, right? All of them have problems. All of them have flaws. And it's always comical to me when someone says, well, you use that version or this version, that's not worth the paper it's printed on. And then I find out what version they're using. And it's just as bad. Because they all have problems, right? They all have issues. We just have to take that into consideration. We need to know what those issues are. We need to do a little bit of research, and we need to, study the strengths and weaknesses. It's like we're going to talk about with study Bibles later on. Be careful with study Bibles. They will show the bias of whoever put those out. And all you have to do is go to Mark chapter 16, verses 15 and 16, or Acts 2:38, and you're going to find their bias. And I would almost guarantee you they're going to promote baptism as an outward sign of an inward change or something of that nature, but not as essential to salvation. And so you have to be careful. As we said, there are biases and there are prejudices, and we have to take that into account. That's why it's important to know the Bible that we're using. So let's look at some strengths and weaknesses of some other versions. Let's carry over from what we talked about last week. Let's look at the New King James. I like the New King James. I use it on occasion. You'll see me use it in sermons at times because I like the way maybe it phrases things or the way it puts things better than the New American Standard, which is what I use most of. But the intent of the translators for the New King James was to update the wording and the grammar of the King James. That was really their intent. They sought to do this without compromising the classical beauty or style of the 1611 version. The New King James translators also kept the same Hebrew and Greek text as the original, but does indicate where other manuscripts differ. In 1984, the New King James was slightly revised by a man named Arthur Farstad, which is why you can find two different New King James with a difference in translation. The New King James is a revision of the King James. The revisers sought to follow the principles of translation used in the original King James, which the New King James revisers call a complete equivalence, as opposed to a dynamic equivalence, like we talked about last week. One of the biggest tasks to updating the King James was changing the word order, changing the grammar, the vocabulary, the spelling. One of the most significant changes in the New King James is the elimination of the second person pronouns like thou and thee and thine, etc. And also, what was revised were those verbs like speaketh or saith, putting th on the end. That was revised as well. One of the biggest strengths of the New King James is its literalness. The New American Standard, which is what I use to preach from, has often been called the most literal translation that we have, but in actuality, the New King James exceeds the New American Standard in many places. The reason for this is because the New King James largely retains those Hebrew and Greek idioms, while the New American Standard sometimes renders these phrases in more understandable language for the English. Now, word usage is another strength of the New King James. You know, I've said it before, I said this last week. I think it's good sometimes that we raise our Bible knowledge instead of dumbing down the Bible to get on to like a seventh grade reading level or whatever. I think we need to increase our knowledge sometimes rather than dumbing it down or diluting it. And I think that's the case with words like propitiation, with sanctification, justification. I think those are words that we need to know. And we need to know the true meaning of those. I don't think we need to water those down. And the New King James retains many of those words, which I think is a good thing. Also, the New King James has done a good job of applying an English meaning wherever maybe that Hebrew or Greek is not as easily understood. I think they do a good job of that. Plus, in my opinion, I think there's a lot of things about the New King James that makes it easier to read than the King James. I realize that there are people out there that love the beautiful language of the King James. They like the Old English or the Elizabethan language, but let's face it, it's kind of laborious. I mean, in my mind, it's hard to read, and I'm not studying with someone using the King James. It's just too hard. It's already difficult sometimes for someone new studying the Bible. They don't need that extra hurdle. And the New King James does a better job of eliminating some of those hard words and the laborious reading, getting rid of some of that archaic language. Another great feature of the New King James is that it's trustworthy. It has great value as a study Bible because it attempts to maintain, as we said, the original Greek and Hebrew words. Many people like the New King James because they can give it to a friend and they can feel confident that they're going to get from it the interpretation that is intended by the translators, that was intended by God, and they feel confident that they can trust it. I will mention, one of the main weaknesses is the fact that it's based solely on the ancient text available during the time of the writing of the King James. And I think that poses a problem. As we've already stated, many other manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, and just better knowledge of the original language have come about since that time. And so this puts the New King James at a bit of a disadvantage. As I said, we have thousands of more manuscripts that are available to us. And so to not take all those into consideration is unfortunate. Also unfortunate is that the New King James seems to have set out to match the form of the King James and merely update the language, rather than fix some of the problems, notable problems with the King James, like we talked about last week, like the use of the word Easter, which made no sense to use that word at that time instead of Passover, or like the trouble with hell and Hades, using the same word there, using Lucifer as a description of Satan. These were errors that should have been corrected, and I'm not sure why they didn't correct those, because it would have been easy to do so. The New King James could have eliminated some of the weaknesses from the King James, but it didn't. Nevertheless, I wouldn't discount it. I do think that it's a valid version of the Bible. Now we kind of step into my area, into the versions that I use, the New American Standard and the English Standard. I preach from the New American Standard. I was turned on to the New American Standard at Harding because we had to do these scripture memorizations. And each week we had to memorize and recite several scriptures. And our professor, Owen Albright, said, you can use whatever version you want, but when it comes to the test, you've got to use the New American Standard. And so that's what stuck. But the more I researched it, the more I realized why we use the New American Standard, because it is considered one of the most literal. It does a good job of translation. You know, translators of the New American Standard worked for 10 years until they felt that the original Greek and Hebrew was ready for publication. The scholars, among whom some were members of the Lord's church, were deemed extremely conservative in their theology. They were committed to emphasizing the full deity of Jesus Christ, and the majority of the translators held doctoral degrees in biblical literature and languages. And so The major strengths of the New American Standard are its literalness. It's a true attempt at a literal word-for-word translation. Some have said that the NASB is unequaled in its faithfulness to the Greek and Hebrew texts. Others have labeled it as severely literalistic, but because of its literalness, the New American Standard Version is a great resource for those wanting to determine the meaning of any given passage. Now, the New American Standard is also extensively researched. It has made extensive use of all the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts that were at its disposal at the time in an effort to arrive at the best possible translation. It also made full use of recent archaeological discoveries, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. As far as a weakness, there are some who feel that the New American Standard has a premillennial slant to it. I don't believe that, but there are some that do. For instance, in Isaiah 2 and verse 2, as well as Micah 4 and verse 1, it reads, "And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it." The word "as" there does not appear in the original text. The actual word is "on," which is reflected in a footnote. Some believe that this reflects a premillennial bias. I know you heard me read that and said, "Oh, premillennial, got to do away with that one." The word, well, let's go here. Others feel that the New American Standard Bible also reflects a Calvinistic preference. Let me tell you, folks, you're going to have a hard time finding a more modern version that doesn't reflect a Calvinistic preference. Unfortunately, that's how it is. But there are some who make that accusation with the New American Standard Bible, and I can kind of see that. There are a few places where the NASB interprets rather than translates. For instance, 1 Peter 1 and 2 reads, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father by the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with His blood. May grace and peace be yours in the fullest measure." Now, there are some who look at that phrase, "who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father," and they believe that that is a preference toward Calvinism. Now, the 1995 version or revision fixed this somewhat, but the implication, some believe, is still there, which is disappointing when you consider that the translators claimed to be translators, not interpreters. But even some of the better versions have translators step into the role of interpreting at times, sometimes where they don't need to. And that happens even with the NASB. It must be admitted, though, that the New American Standard is a valid version, and the one that I find preference with, but I'm certainly objective about it as well. For one, it's wordy in places. The New American Standard Bible is not always concise and succinct. Sometimes the wordiness is an effort of trying to keep the Greek words to their original order rather than reword the sentence to where it makes more sense and is more concise. The New American Standard will sometimes keep the word order found in the original manuscripts, which can make it a little bit awkward. And I think an example of this would be Matthew chapter 24 and verse 8. "But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs." Why do you need "merely" there? It's italicized to show you it was added, but you don't need that word. It doesn't do anything to help or hurt. You could just leave it out, right? All that being said, I do believe that this is a good version, and I think it's a good balance between being easy to read and still true to the text. Now, in my personal study, I use the English Standard Version. Not exclusively, but that's the one I use most often. And if you ever use the website ChristianCourier.com, I would suggest that you do so. That's a great website. It's sponsored by Wayne Jackson and his two kids. One of them we've had here to do Equip many years ago, Jason Jackson. And there are a lot of good articles, a lot of good reviews of different Bible translations. And one of the reviews is on the English Standard Version. And it's a very objective review. Now, Wayne Jackson tends to believe, like I do as well, that it's a valid version, but he points out some of the strengths and weaknesses. Understand that this version was introduced in 2001, and the ESV seeks, as far as possible, to capture the precise wording of the original text and personal style of each Bible writer. the aim of its translators was to produce a word-for-word edition. Now again, we talked about word for word, we talked about dynamic equivalency. This is an effort for a word for word. And this, as we said last week, is the better, in my mind, the best type of version that we could get and use in our regular Bible study is a word for word. Anytime you go with dynamic equivalency, anytime you go thought for thought, you're leaving yourself open for problems and for errors. And so definitely think that the way to go is more of a form equivalency rather than a dynamic equivalency. Now, there are times, as I said, that the dynamic equivalency method is useful, but that's only when there's a difficulty in making a phrase fit in the English. So sometimes you have to do a thought for thought or a dynamic equivalency, but by and large, I think word for word is better, and I think the ESV has attempted to do that. There are several strengths of this version. First of all, it is translated from the latest collection of Hebrew and Greek documents. This gives it strongest textual foundation of anything produced to date. Second, the ESV appears to have been produced by men who attempted to, and I quote, carry over every possible nuance of meaning in the original words into our English language. And that's not something to scoff at. That's a big deal. And we should want a translation to do that. It's encouraging, especially when you consider that so many recent versions are characterized by more liberal tendencies. And another strength is that it contains the clarity and the accuracy that so many of the earlier versions lacked. For instance, give you an example. The ESV uses the word expanse in Genesis 1 and instead of firmament. In Genesis 22:1, it notes that God tested Abraham. God did not tempt him, as some versions put it, especially the King James. Thee and thou are replaced with more contemporary pronouns. Concerning the Sunday collection, the ESV correctly translates on the first day of every week, whereas both the King James and even the ASV omits the term every. I also like to point out that the ESV gives a fair treatment of the subject of baptism. We talked about that last week. I always find it comical when members of the Lord's church want to divide a congregation over using the King James. And thinking that that's the only version you can use, and if you use anything else, we're going to disfellowship you. How important is baptism to us as members of the Lord's church? It means everything, right? The King James can't even translate it correctly. They made exception for sprinkling, pouring on purpose. And so the ESV does a good job of cleaning that up. It's more accommodating to the original meaning, whereas so many of the versions today, and even back so far ago, wanted to accommodate for more denominational thinking in this way. But the ESV is not without its problems. Again, it's not perfect. There are no flawless translations, and certainly the ESV is not flawless. I personally wish the ESV had done like the New American Standard and used italics when words had been added for clarification. I think it's a minor difficulty, but another difficulty is that the ESV is not always literal. And like the New American Standard, the ESV tries to be literal, but in its effort to be literal, it reads awkwardly at times. Acts chapter 3 and verse 11, it says, while he clung to Peter and John, all the people, utterly astounded, ran together to them in the portico called Solomon's. It's kind of clunky, isn't it? I mean, that could read a lot easier, right? Why not just say Solomon's portico? Why do you have to word it that way? But they did. And so there are some times in the ESV where you see some awkwardness in the wording. It's clunky in the way that it reads. But I think overall it's an accurate, literal translation that's well written. As I said, I use it in my personal Bible study. If you have a smartphone, you can go to the App Store. You can get the ESV Bible. I mean, just type in ESV Bible, and you can get that on your phone. That's what I use a lot of times, and it has daily Bible reading plans. It has a lot of different things that you can use it for, but I think it's a useful tool. Last one. This last one I'm going to approach, and because it's really falls in line with the other ones I've talked about, I know a little bit of something about them. So if I didn't mention your version, I'm sorry. I may not know much about it, but the New Revised Standard Version. Anybody use the New Revised Standard Version? Nobody wants to admit it? You want to wait and see what I say about it first, right? It may be that some of you use it. This is a revision of the Revised Standard Version, which some people say, why? Why did you revise a revision? But nevertheless, they did. As we've already stated, as more manuscripts were discovered and more archaeological evidence unearthed, more known about the Greek, the Aramaic, and the Hebrew, it became necessary to revise some of these older Bible translations. And that's what the New Revised Standard Version is. It's an attempt to do that. It's an effort under the leadership of Bruce Metzger. And it's a committee of around 30 men who worked at scheduled times for about 15 years. And the task was to improve the Revised Standard Version by changing some of the paragraph structure, some of the punctuation, reducing some of the archaic language that was no longer in use, striving for a greater accuracy and clarity, and also to eliminate all masculine-oriented language when referring to both men and women. You realize a lot of your versions, when it's generic or gender neutral, they just use he. And the New Revised Standard eliminated that. It uses like one instead of he. So, readers of the New Revised Standard will notice the two things that stand out. First of all, thee and thou and similar outdated words are not used. And secondly, in cases where the original language referred to men and women in general, the male-oriented language is not used. For instance, man shall not live by bread alone. The New Revised Standard says one shall not live by bread alone. One of the major strengths that the New Revised Standard Version has is that it comes on the heels of the Revised Standard, which has been held in high esteem for many years as very credible. The translation style of the New Revised Standard is what many find most appealing about it. Any serious Bible student, I think, should seek a translation that is as literal as possible because, as we've already stated, thought for thought leaves itself open to too many prejudices and biases. And the New Revised Standard is essentially a literal translation. What paraphrases it has are minimal and exist to compensate for the deficiency in the English language. Like we said before, there are some things that just don't translate. And so the New Revised Standard does a good job of trying to capture the thought there when there's not a true and accurate representation. As far as weakness, there does tend to be that Calvinistic preference again, like we see in a lot of our modern translations. The New Revised Standard absolutely butchers Psalms 51 and 5, which reads, "Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me." That doesn't leave much room for doubt as to whether that's a Calvinistic slant or not, right? It most definitely is. The gender inclusiveness is probably more of an annoyance, maybe, than a weakness. Some Greek words are gender neutral, but the English does not have gender neutral pronouns. So when gender neutral words arise, the New Revised Standard consistently uses inclusive language. And some think that this makes the translation wordier and a little awkward to read. So the New Revised Standard is a solid translation in my mind. Some believe it to be an unnecessary revision of the old, but I think we can say that it is a pretty reliable translation. So in conclusion, I think there's probably other translations that some of you use. I don't know about many of the others. I've heard of some of the others. I just hadn't done an in-depth study. And we could go on and on for many weeks looking at all the different versions. And as I've said, some of them are not worth the paper they're printed on. Some of them are not good at all. But I think by and large, we grow up using a certain version and we believe it to be the best, and we fail to consider that all of them have their problems. I've heard for many years that the NIV is just worthless. I don't believe the NIV is worthless. I wouldn't prop it up as the best, but I don't believe it's worthless. I believe the translators were trying to do a good thing into making it more readable. They say it's readable for a 7th grader and up. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. It's just it leaves itself open in some areas. Just as I don't believe the King James is the standard. I just don't, and I don't believe that anybody can argue that. I still think it's a valid translation. But let's be careful in propping up one translation above all the others and believing that it's the best and it's the only one and condemning other people for using other translations because they all have problems. There's issues with all of them. And let's remember these things. Not one of them is perfect. Translations are produced by fallible men, and some degree of subjective interpretation can be seen in each Bible version. That doesn't mean, however, that some translations are really bad. Also, there are some that are good. But none of them are perfect. Again, a word-for-word philosophy or literal translation is best. I would advise you to use that in your daily Bible study. Do your homework. Know what the philosophy was of your translators. Know about the inconsistencies or the flaws that may exist. Don't be too quick to condemn or laud. In other words, be open about this. Don't be afraid to use multiple versions. Just because you grew up in a home where only one version was used doesn't mean that that's the only version you can use. Doesn't even mean it was the best. As we said in the beginning, consider that we have much more manuscript evidence today. We know much more about the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic languages. We have much more in the way of archaeological discoveries. That's just naturally going to make our more modern versions, at least some of them, better. It just does. And so you can talk about how great the King James is, and that's fine. You can use it. It's not superior, right? And neither is the American Standard, which is a great version, and it was a great version at its time. But number one, it's hard to find anymore, and number two, just because of the mountain of evidence that we have since the time it was published. And again, some of these versions that I like will be outdated eventually if the Lord doesn't come back, right? Just because of all the evidence that we continue to gain. So, that was more of a lecture than a sermon, but I hope that it was helpful. And next week we're going to look at more of attention to detail when it comes to Bible study. We're going to look at, over the next 3 weeks, observation, interpretation, and application. So I hope you'll be with us. As we close, if there's a need that you might have that we can help you with, that there's something that is weighing on your heart, that you need the prayers and support of this church family, or perhaps you are ready to put on Christ in baptism, whatever your need is, come now as we stand.